We're going to talk about one of the most celebrated and perhaps controversial pianists on the planet today. He receives a lot of acclaim from most listeners and jazz aficionados, but then there are some who say, well, he's just outside the mainstream of jazz, so I'm not going to give him all that credit. Suffice it to say, he's a bad cat who does what he wants to do. Okay? He was born Bradford Alexander Mehldau in 1970, believe it or not, in Jacksonville, Florida. And they only stayed there, the family only stayed there for a few years, and eventually moved to Connecticut, where he grew up, went to school, he studied the piano at an early age, classical music primarily, played in the junior high and high school jazz bands, and by 15 he was playing gigs at local clubs. Yeah, reminds me of somebody I know, playing gigs at 15 in the bars, learning how to do what you do. Upon graduation from high school, he moved to New York City, but not before he went to a jazz festival with his high school jazz band and was recognized for his outstanding musicianship by the Berklee School of Music, who I would imagine thought they could recruit him by giving him honors and offering him scholarships and that kind of thing, which they did do. But Brad wanted to go to New York. New York, the Big Apple, baby, that's where I'm going. So he enrolled in the New School and studied classical music and jazz with legends in both areas, because when you're in New York, you can find the best of the best in any genre, most certainly in any idiom, and he pushed himself both in the classical music arena and in the jazz arena. As he's playing gigs with more and more people, his reputation started to grow, and people start pointing to him as one of the new young lions. He has this incredible technical ability, which comes from having studied classical music for such a long time. And in his early development as a jazz player, his main influences would have been Oscar Peterson, for sure, and Wynton Kelly, who were both fairly traditional jazz pianists in terms of comping with the left hand and doing all that improvisation with the right hand for the most part. But Brad very early on developed an affinity to free a left hand. He did not want to just, as my friend John would say, I call him Dr. John O'Leary, Dr. John O'Leary, yeah. John says the claw, the left hand claw. He wanted to do more with that left hand. And having studied classical music, he most certainly has studied Brahms and other German romanticists, and where the left hand, it most certainly has to be free and heavily developed, or you cannot play the music. Reminds me, by the way, of a local pianist who was on the international stage for a long time as a pianist with a similar background, very heavily steeped in classical music, went into popular music as a young guy, and then eventually into jazz. And I'm talking about Kenny Drew Jr. A lot of you all listening to this will remember Kenny Drew and his just awesome talent. And if you don't, you should probably go buy some recordings or find some videos, because you missed a real star. But Kenny had this thing of classical music, and he liked squealing, because squealing had these pieces for left hand only, and he could play an entire jazz piece with left hand. I diverge. So could Brad Mehldau. He freed that left hand from the tyranny of the claw, which gave him more interplay between the hands, improvisation with both hands, and then just interplay of separate lines. Okay, he just could do that. He could improvise in both hands and duplicate and match and have one hand talk the other. He was just completely independent and was technically proficient in both hands, and that affected his style going forward. Early on in the 90s, late 80s, he finds himself with a bunch of other young lions in a group led by Josh Redman. In that band with Brad and Brian Blade and the bass ace, Mr. Christian McBride. What a group that was. And that's where I first studied and discovered Brad in that group. And at that time, he was playing more of a traditional jazz style, because that was pretty much the direction of that particular ensemble. And of course, it was Josh's group, Josh's music for the most part, and so he was kind of limited in what he could do. Later on, he started his own trios with Larry Grenadier on the bass and Jorge Rossi on drums, and the interplay on all three. Grenadier will create independent lines, Jorge creating time and flavors and shimmerings and colors, and textures, and Brad being able to do his magic. That group has been his main thrust in performance. He lacks the freedom of that trio, although he's done things with full orchestration, 28, 30-piece orchestrations, but the trio is where he's comfortable. He also has done quite a lot of solo piano work, because that allows him even more freedom to create as he chooses in the spur of the moment. He continues, even as he is doing his jazz explorations, to incorporate classical music, and he has even recorded improvisations on Bach preludes and the like. So he is continuing to blend the two and finding a marriage with what most people would say are two very diverse idioms. However, those of us who do know music history, we do realize that Bach himself was a great improviser. Yeah, figure bass and everything else he created on the spot. So there is some similarity in the journey, even though one is a Baroque period classical musician, and here we got this modern jazz person. Brad also is comfortable with electronic keyboards and has even done tours as a performing keyboardist on electronic keyboards and synthesizers with just a drummer. So he also understands and uses technology and is very, very comfortable with that. He has composed song cycles, as in romantic period song cycles in the classical side, primarily on commissions from places like Carnegie Hall, and things that are using orchestrations and singers and the like. And he has been richly rewarded for that in terms of artistic acclaim and acceptability in the classical market. Matter of fact, in 2011, I believe it was, the Carnegie appointed him to a esteemed composer's chair, and he was the first person in their history to sit in that chair that was not a classical musician. He's the first jazz musician to sit in that composer's chair, as sponsored by Carnegie. So Brad has achieved in many, many, many areas. Let's please remember that his desire was to explore all of the talents and technique and abilities he had and combine it into not just jazz, as Ellington likes to say, beyond category. Brad is one of those musicians whose work may be in many areas beyond category. Not jazz, not classic, it's music, it's art. And that is what he is trying to do on a personal level. Now, of course, he's married to a Dutch jazz singer. So at some point, he likes jazz, or he would not have married a jazz singer, because those of us who knew jazz, we know what difficult characters jazz musicians can be, especially jazz singers. I'll leave that alone. But that's working very well for him. He had been compared to Bill Evans. And that's it may be more about race than it is about the music, because although they were both classically trained, although they both had, how shall we say this, drug dependencies at one point or another in their lives, their styles are quite different, whereas Bill Evans was more of a French impressionist style of classical music embedded in his jazz. Brad is more of the Germanic Romantic period influences of Brahms, later Beethoven, and Wagner, that is influencing his musical journey. He is just the complete musician. He is comfortable in all sorts of idioms. He has taken his training both in classical and jazz and created something that is actually new and innovative, and very, very few people have taken that path. I named Kenny Drew Jr. as one that I personally know that was on a similar path. And he has been rewarded in terms of artistic acclaim, recognition, and he's making a pretty good living at it as well. And he is influencing yet another generation of jazz pianists in terms of what the future of jazz can look like. So, and Brad is still young, born in 1970. So he's got a long way to go, and his influence is just starting. And what a great journey he has had, and who knows what's next in this journey that has been so pivotal for jazz pianists so far. So thank you for listening. And if you really want to understand what I'm talking about, just go out and listen to Brad Mehldau. Solo piano work, trio work, and then listen to him in other sorts of ensembles, and then take a listen to his classical work as well. You will be richly rewarded. Thank you very much.